In this lecture, we'll conclude our investigation of composition. We'll start by looking at some of the major attributes of shape, then we'll dig deeper into the compositional strategies that artists use in their work. And now that we've studied gestural line, we can apply it to test out these new compositional structures. Different kinds of shape, like different kinds of line, have different attributes or qualities, and most of us associate different feelings or sensation with them because of those differences. Let's look at both the Holbein and the Indian Punjab Hills drawing in this regard. In both, we can see a range of shapes deployed. Some are geometric. Among those, some are rectilinear, while others are curvilinear. And some are not geometric, but organic. Some geometric and some organic shapes are symmetrical, while others are asymmetrical. And related to symmetry, some shapes are simple, while others are complex. All else being equal, we'll generally reward greater complexity, a source of visual excitement, with our attention. That explains why in both drawings, the figures in their drapery are drawn in elaborate line and shape, very organic, complex, and asymmetrical. It also explains why the drapes hanging behind the figures are simplified. They're geometric and symmetrical. Both artists want us to look at the figures first and use complexity of shape compositionally to focus our attention on the figures. These same factors, geometric versus organic, and the level of symmetry, also communicate personality. Some shapes appear serious and sober. Rectilinear and symmetrical shapes generally have this quality. Curvilinear shapes can appear elegant and flowing, and very asymmetrical, loopy organic shapes can seem humorous. Superheroes like Superman, Batman, and the like are constructed using symmetrical and relatively angular shapes. Homer Simpson, in contrast, is much less symmetrical. He's curvilinear to the point of being bulbous. Forgetting about a given plot, the dialogue, or the expressions on an animated character's face, their silhouettes alone, their very shapes, will conjure a specific emotional response. And of course, this plays out in real life as well. Network executives tend to hire sober-shaped people to serve as news anchors. These jobs generally require symmetrical features, strong angular jaws, and an upright posture. Think Charlie Rose. Men like Danny DeVito or Louis C.K., however brilliant, are unlikely to be given these kinds of opportunities. You could say that many of us, in terms of shape, are biased. We're predisposed to certain conclusions about an individual based on their shape. Put another way, shape at an abstract level can foster an emotional response in us. All of these considerations relate to composition and expression. Earlier, we noted that lines can have different degrees of openness or closure. The greater the degree of closure, the more the line appears to be a shape. Let's take a look at a rectangle. We'll draw one side, clearly not a shape. Draw another side, again, not yet a shape. But as we begin to draw the third side, it begins to suggest its own completion. Halfway through the final side, it's looking pretty much like a shape. We can try this with a circle too. As we begin to move past the halfway point, it begins to feel more and more shape-like. Even with very unpredictable and irregular shapes, once we get close enough to the point of origin, we begin to read shape, even though it's not completed. In the Holbein, we see these implied shapes in many places. For instance, in the central figure in Sir Thomas More's cloak, the pleats aren't fully closed, yet they feel very much like shape. These two feel like triangles, though the shapes haven't been closed. And in the drape hanging behind the figures, we see rectilinear and triangular shape-like entities, but these are also open, though they clearly imply shapes. The Punjab Hills drawing yields similar results in both the man's and the woman's drapery and in the drapery hanging behind them. The reason why shapes are left somewhat open is often for practical reasons. It's done to create the sensation of continuity. The overlaps of the pleats in More's robe are gentle. We're meant to move from one pleat to another and feel that they're all part of the same piece of continuous fabric. We can contrast this approach with the one taken in More's fur collar, or the wide sleeve on his left arm. Both are closed and read as strongly overlapping the rest of the robe. They're discontinuous. Open shape equals gentler overlap and continuity. Closed shape indicates emphatic overlap and discontinuity. When drawing, ask yourself, how discreetly or emphatically do you want a planar junction to read? If we look at the footstool in this regard, we see that the shapes are about 90% closed and the planes read emphatically. Shape stability is directly related to what we've already noted about line direction and line stability. A shape like this rectangle resting on its horizontal base projects stability. A triangle resting on the same size base appears a bit less stable. It shows active diagonals. A triangle with a smaller base, well, less so. Now rotate the triangle 180 onto its tip and we're much less stable. And tilt the triangle so it sits on a diagonal and there's very little sense of stability at all. Tilting things is a visual trope we often see on television and in film. The director changes a camera's angle relative to what we know should be horizontal and vertical in the shot. Floors and walls and the things that sit on them, or trees and houses in a landscape, go all diagonal. Without anyone saying a word, we know something's amiss. Let's try it here. As the camera tilts, I look less in control and authoritative, more like a passenger on the Titanic. All the shapes have shifted from stable horizontals and verticals to less stable ones. Everything's pitching diagonal. The factors we've just discussed, how geometric or organic our shapes are, how open or closed, their degree of symmetry, complexity, and stability, are all important compositional factors and will, ultimately, affect the expressive quality in a drawing. With all this in mind, let's return to some examples of compositional strategies used by artists in their drawings. A very balanced strategy related to the use of symmetrical shapes is what I call the target. It uses centered rings or successive units of framing to bring you into the center or bullseye. It's what Rembrandt uses here. The positive shape of the doghouse turns the aggregate negative shape bounded by the drawing's border into a framing outer ring. The doghouse itself becomes the next ring. The dark interior around the dog's body, the next. Then we get the dog's body, and finally the bullseye, the dog's head. It's clear that the focal area is a sleeping dog, the focal point, the dog's head. There are several compositional factors which lead us to read the drawing in this way. The first has to do with contrasting shape types. A rectangle is, well, just a rectangle. And an ellipse is an ellipse. But put a rectangle next to an ellipse, and we tend to feel their rectilinear and curvilinear qualities in a heightened way. The second type of contrast has to do with sameness or repetition and difference, or uniqueness. If we have one rectangle and one ellipse, we'll pay about equal attention to both. But if we have 5 rectangles and one ellipse, we'll pay more attention to the ellipse. We'll generally pay more attention to what's ever different in our field of vision. Our eye will go to the guy in the Speedo walking down Madison Avenue and to the guy in the suit and tie playing volleyball at the beach. The way this plays out here is that the drawing's shape is rectilinear. The internal frames representing the doghouse are rectilinear too. Only the dog is curvilinear, so it'll get more attention. A third and related type of contrast has to do with geometric versus organic. The rectilinear elements are relatively geometric, the curvilinear ones relatively organic. A fourth type of contrast has to do with the degree of density and complexity of line or mark. This is often related to detail. Here's the principle. The more dense and complex the marks in a given part of a drawing relative to the drawing as a whole, the more we'll often pay attention to that part. Here, the dog's head gets the densest and most complex marks, and that translates as detail. And that, once again, mimics the way we see. When we focus on something, we literally bring out the detail in what we're looking at. As we've seen already, when the camera focuses on me, my detail emerges, and the details of my producer, Jamie, behind me become obscured. If we invert this and have the camera focus on Jamie, I lose my detail. Let's note Rembrandt's choice of rectangle and its divisions. The rectangle itself is more horizontal than vertical, expressive of sleeping. And let's look at the divisions. We get a stress along the horizontal half and quarters. We also get a stress along the vertical quarters. In addition, A number of things, including the dog's head, line up along one of the rectangles diagonal. Similarly, we get the ears and a number of other things lining up with a contrasting diagonal. And remember, diagonals are our most powerful attention-grabbing direction. This brings us to our final type of contrast of direction. Diagonal versus horizontal and vertical. The dog gets the most powerful diagonals. Most of the rest of the drawing is constructed using horizontals and verticals, and the most prominent diagonals, not related to the dog, those on the top of the doghouse, are mitigated by being close to vertical. So there are multiple compounding abstract factors, compositional factors, that make us read the drawing the way we do. We see it's a drawing of a dog in a doghouse, but without anyone telling us anything, we know the sleeping dog's the star of the drawing, and we zoom in on the dog's head. We're brought to do this in a totally nonverbal way. It's automatic. We've been visually manipulated, and that's a very good thing. That's just what composition does. Rembrandt's made us read the drawing this way because he chose a horizontal rectangle communicating stasis, rest, and sleep. He constructed the drawing like a target, putting the dog's head in the center, in the bullseye position. He not only puts the dog in the topographical central position, but also in the middle depth of space. In other words, there's a foreground, a midground, and a background. The dog goes in the middle. He links the dog's head to the central diagonals, among the most attention-grabbing directions. The dog's association with the diagonals is in marked contrast with the rest of the drawing, which Rembrandt constructs primarily out of horizontals and verticals. He also makes the dog different from most of the rest of the drawing. The dog's curvilinear in contrast to the rectilinear. The dog's organic in contrast to all the geometric elements. The treatment of the dog's head exhibits more dense and complex marks, more detail. That draws us in and causes us to focus. It seems like a simple little drawing of a dog sleeping, but as you see, there's really quite a bit of abstract visual thinking involved. So, I'd like you to try a drawing using the target strategy. Walk around your home or office and look for things that could lend themselves to this treatment. Here are a couple ideas to stimulate your imagination. You could pose a log or two on a grate in a fireplace framed by the surrounding fireplace walls. You could look down at an object, for example, a folded scarf in a rectangular drawer. Again, looking down, you could pose an apple or flower on a plate, on a placemat, on a small low table with the floor seen around it on all sides. There are many other possibilities. It's a matter of engaging your curiosity and imagination to uncover some possibilities. Try to follow Rembrandt's model. Choose a format shape, objects, and a point of view so that you get a variety of contrasts. Think about contrast of direction, contrast of the curvilinear with the rectilinear, contrast of the organic with the geometric, and contrast of complexity and density of line with simplicity and paucity of line. Do the drawings that accompany this lecture with gesture align. You'll move through the drawing problems much more quickly than with contour or cross contour. And as you work through each drawing, use a range of line weights and qualities, from thin to thick, light to dark, slow to fast, from angular to curved, from short to long, and from open to closed. In our analysis of Rembrandt's Sleeping Dog, we noted a number of instances of repetition and variation. And these are key compositional concepts in their own right. Most of the drawing is built on a repetition of vertical and horizontal stresses, all geometric. The dog introduces variation through the use of diagonals, curvilinear directions, and organic shape. A lot of composing deals with repetitions and variations on those repetitions. Musical composition can revolve around the structural idea as well. A Bach two-part invention, it's all about repetition and variation. So are popular songs. Choruses repeat, verses vary, generally same melody, but new lyrics. This would indicate that we like an amount of repetition, but too much is monotonous. A simple grid would likely be too simple for most. An intricate pattern based on that grid would probably be more interesting to look at. What pattern proposes is similarity. We get the same grid unit, but different units get different structures or visual event. repetition with variation. We see this in the Aikens watercolor. We have lots of horizontal events. Start with Bigland's skull. It's echoed by his reflection in the water, by the other skulls, by the wavelets in the water, by the landscape in the distance, and by the striations in the sky. Repetition with variation. This is often referred to as visual rhyming, shapes and directions that get repeated rhythmically to create relationships among the parts. The triangles in the Picasso are not limited to the figure, but occur in the negative shapes around the figure and in events in the room itself. There are many rhyming rectangles as well. We find something similar in the Diebenkorn. Triangles and spheroid shapes, completed and implied in both the positives and the negatives. And the Morandi rhymes the bottle shapes with the negatives that occur between them. The negative between the two bottles on the right is an inverted and contracted version of the bottles themselves. The large aggregate negative between the bottle on the left and the bottle to its right is an inverted and contracted version. As a first go, you might want to try this with a couple of bottles. The trick is to find shapes that when combined produce negatives that rhyme with the positives. Another dependable way to get rhymes is to pose something in front of a mirror, or look for objects that have similar structures, rounded objects, triangular objects, or rectangular objects. Or find objects that rhyme with the ground they sit in, and like Morandi, pay a lot of attention to those negatives. So far, we've looked at relationships that occur on the surface of the drawing, basically in the realm of the flat. We've seen how artists organize what they want to draw in relationship to the geometry of the specific rectangle they've chosen. We've also seen how there's a relationship between the main things being depicted, the ostensible subject, and the environment in which they sit. I'm alluding to object-ground or figure-ground relationships. We've already noted that we have to think two ways simultaneously. First, we have to think about how things relate flatly to the rectangle's edges and armature. Second, how they relate to any illusion of depth. Inextricably related to both of these considerations is the specific spatial organization of the drawing. And I want to think if you can imagine seeing the space in a drawing from the side. Try to imagine the space as accordion-like. It could be pushed in and condensed toward flatness or pulled out to create a very great depth indeed. And using the same subject and the same rectangle will wind up with very different compositions depending on that spatial organization. Here in the studio, the camera could zoom in, cropping me at the nose and hips. Or zoom out so there's real space in front of me. It might even include something occupying that space to help define it, like the camera here in the foreground. Now, I'm in the midground. We see the furniture, spiral staircase, and windows behind me in the background. 3 depths of space, just what we saw in the Rembrandt of the sleeping dog. Of course, you do this all the time when you compose a snapshot. You zoom in and you zoom out. And you'll be missing a lot if you don't consider spatial depth when composing a drawing. In Norman Lundine's Model Standing Before a Blackboard, the space is shallow. We're zoomed in right up next to the model. They're only several inches behind her before we get to the blackboard. We refer to this kind of space as bas relief, literally low relief, like Lincoln on a penny. One way of beginning to open the depth of space is to use an entry space. The white at the bottom of the page below the woman's dress is not inert paper. It's serving to push the woman Saskia back in space. Through the entry space, Rembrandt creates a space in which she can exist. She'll appear more volumetric than otherwise, and this without a lot of shading. The key here is that we can make objects feel three-dimensional by thinking compositionally. Conversely, a ham-fisted cropping can flatten the same figure. In essence, cropping is a form of zooming in. The more severe the crop, the more we diminish the depth of space, and the more we potentially flatten our subject. Aikens' drawing, Bigland Brothers Turning the Stake, has an expanded depth relative to Rembrandt. It's a much more zoomed out view, and we have 3 depths of space. As we'll see, that's a very common motif. Here we have water and reflection in the foreground. Our main subjects occupy the midground, and there are other events occurring back deep in space, in the background. We note the same spatial organization in his watercolor. water and reflection in the foreground, our main subjects located in the midground, and there's a depth of space with a number of supporting events occurring in and around the horizon. And this structure doesn't just apply to landscape or figures in a landscape. Here, the floor is foreground, the figure midground, and the drapes construct the background, 3 depths of space. This school of Rembrandt, A Woman Ill in Bed, is set up similarly. Though here, the forespace is defined by the scribbled line on the right, a gestural line to be sure. We don't know what it is. It could be a bedpost, could be a door opened into the room, could even be a bathrobe hung on the wall. So we don't know what it is, but we do know where it is. It's the out-of-focus thing in the foreground. We focus on the woman in the midground. The wall in the background is implied by the pillows. We find the same compositional template in the Picasso. The foreground's defined by the woman at the easel, the floor, and the still life on the right. The nude, our main subject, is in the midground. The rest of the room is in our 3rd depth of space. In our Punjab Hills, Two Lovers, we find the identical structure. The foreground is established by floor plane and still life objects. Our main figures occupy the midground, a wall plane occupies the background. A very common motif, 3 depths of space with the most important event located in the midground. And as we see here and in the Eakins watercolor, the Picasso, and the Rembrandt, it's often accompanied by placing the main subject in the topographical center of the page as well. The foreground can also be asserted by part of an object or figure. In White Doe at Home, Lundin defines the foreground with the model's leg and foot and on the front part of the bed. The arm, chest, head, pillows, back of the bed, and the front portion of the floor establish the midground, and the rear of the floor and the wall establish our 3rd depth of space. Picasso uses a similar idea in his portrait of Apollinaire. The front leg and hand establish the foreground. The rest of the body, head, and chair establish the midground. The wall and shelf establish the background. We note the same spatial organization in Seshutoyo's Autumn Landscape, foreground, midground, and background disappearing in the fog. Though here, the greatest emphasis is on the foreground. The Mayuen also has 3 depths of space, and it also puts the greater focus on the foreground. There are other important ideas about composition in space. Many are at the heart of much of the art of the late 19th century to the present, and we'll be discussing them in greater detail in later lectures. But now you're ready to try a couple drawings using different spatial approaches. A great first exercise is to place a single object, a bottle or other similar object on your table, an inch or so from the wall. Frame it very simply, center it, but draw from a distance with your viewfinder opened up wide. Follow this by making a drawing where you're cropping the bottle at the top and the bottom. Then make 2 more variations at intervals between the wide and close in view. This will give you a very clear idea about how important decision this is. There's a very strong correlation between the sensation of space and volume in the subject and the amount of surface we have between the object or aggregate object and the drawing's edges. A next exercise would be to set up a still life using a shallow bas-relief space, and then another with 3 depths of space. And you can try this with the interior of your home, and outdoors too, in a landscape. The more you look at the world around you for instances of compositional opportunity, the more you'll readily find them. The more you do this, the more thinking compositionally becomes second nature. Last, once you've done this observationally, try it from your imagination. Draw with shapes and volumes, construct your compositions with reference to these strategies we've discussed. The way we pose things and organize them on the page can have narrative import as well. Here's a portrait of the Stamati family drawn in 1818 by the French artist Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. You'll note he's making use of many of the compositional devices we've already spoken about. There's a division at the vertical and horizontal halves, and a strong use of the diagonal half. Though a shallow space, we still have 3 depths. The foreground is established by the floor and the toy cart. The figures are grouped in the midground, and the piano, wall, and painting sit in the background. The figures fit into an aggregate shape, something like a simple house shape, rectangle with a triangle on top. The weight of the 4 figures on the right is counterbalanced by the toys, figure on the left, piano, and the painting on the wall. The composition is asymmetrical but balanced. But there's something new going on here too. The composition has a narrative aspect. The figures have been posed and framed to tell us something about the family. The father's top dog, elevated. The elder son comes next. He's posed jauntily above his mother. Then we get the two women, mother just a bit above the daughter and the child last. While the father, son, mother, and child form a solid subgrouping, the daughter is off by herself. Why? Well, she's of marriageable age. She's on the way out. And to make the point that you'd be lucky to grab her, she's posed as a mirror image of her mother, a visual rhyme. She's ready to take on her mother's role, produce children. Even better, she plays piano. You'll have children and the home will be filled with music. It's a piece of high-class advertising. And of course, professionals in illustration and advertising and people choreographing political campaigns use these visual strategies all the time to make their products or candidates look more appealing. Think presidential candidates who argue about podium height before a debate, or jockey to be photographed with military hardware. So, let's try this. We don't necessarily need figures. Still life objects will work fine. Pose your object so that you have distinct groupings, hierarchies, and personalities. As in the Ingres, you could try 1 against 4. You could also try one tall object versus several short ones, or one flamboyant object versus several conservative ones, or a skinny object versus several fat ones. And of course, we can try the inverse of all of these. Later, you'll be able to try all these same ideas and apply them to the figure. We've covered a lot of material on composition. Making it your own takes time and practice. All these distinct pieces that we're practicing individually, one by one, will become more and more interconnected. They'll often act in concert. You'll find yourself applying these principles intuitively once you've practiced them for some time. Einstein's quoted as saying, quote, "Intuition is nothing but the outcome of earlier intellectual experience," unquote. Like learning to read or learning arithmetic, at first it's painfully slow, but with time it becomes automatic. A note on this. As you look around at drawings, you'll see that not all drawings are composed in the ways we've been discussing here. That's because not all drawings are intended as complete or finished artworks in their own right. Different kinds of drawings have different goals. For instance, some drawings concern themselves with problem solving, or with learning something, or figuring something out. Leonardo often used drawing as a tool to help himself understand the physical world. In this drawing of a fetus, he wasn't setting out to make a finished art object, but was using drawing along with note-taking as a means to learn something about a specific subject and record it. Other drawings function as exercises. Dürer made hundreds of diagrammatic drawings investigating human proportions. He used them to gain a greater understanding of proportions in all their variety. And this Michelangelo is a study, a drawing done in preparation for a specific work. All three of these drawings are about learning something specific. The goal is gathering information. So there's no need to compose in the way we've been talking about. Other drawings might target studying perspective, pattern, value, relationships of color, or other kinds of relationships. This drawing by Rembrandt is also not what might be termed a quote-unquote finished work. And it's also about learning something. But it's about learning something about composition, so by definition, it's composed. I'd contrast these drawings with this one by Norman Lundin, which is meant as a finished work in its own right. The compositional choices we make regarding how we draw are often based on the goal we have for the drawing in question. Next, I'd like to introduce some very effective ways for controlling proportions. Combining these new techniques with what you've already learned about line, shape, volume, and composition will give you the basics to make some pretty sophisticated drawings.